The biscuit hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. Belle Fletcher's brown eyes were blazing, her flour-dusted hands planted flat on the scarred wooden surface, and she was staring down Patrick Finley with the kind of ferocity that had reportedly made grown men back down in 3 counties. The kitchen of the Finley ranch smelled of smoke and burnt dough, and the silence that followed that thunderous impact was so complete that even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. "That," Belle said, her voice low and trembling with barely contained fury, "is the worst biscuit I have ever produced in my 23 years on this earth, and I will tell you exactly why, Mr. Finley, since you apparently think you know better than me about the proportions of lard to flour." Patrick stood across from her, arms crossed over his broad chest, jaw set in the hard, permanent line that the people of Caldwell, Kansas had grown accustomed to seeing on his face over the past 2 years. He was 31 years old and carried the kind of quiet devastation that people whispered about when they thought he couldn't hear them. Dark circles had become permanent features under his gray eyes. The smile that old-timers swore used to light up half a room had vanished so completely that some of the newer ranch hands doubted it had ever existed at all. "I never said I knew better," he said, his voice flat and careful like a man navigating a minefield. "I said you use too much. Too much lard makes a biscuit tender, Patrick Finley. Not enough makes a biscuit a weapon." She picked it up and knocked it against the table again, deliberately watching his face. "Listen to that. You could knock a man cold with this thing. You could use this as a doorstop. You could build a wall with 4 of these and it would stand until the end of time." Something shifted in his expression. Something so faint and so unfamiliar that it flickered and nearly vanished before it fully arrived. The corner of his mouth, the right corner specifically, twitched upward with a motion so involuntary that he clearly had no idea it was happening. Belle saw it. She stopped speaking. He caught himself almost immediately and the iron mask came back down, but it was too late. She had seen it with her own 2 eyes, that ghost of something warm, that fragment of a man who had apparently once laughed freely and often. And in that single heartbeat, standing in a smoke-damaged kitchen on a struggling cattle ranch in the autumn of 1882, Belle Fletcher made a decision that would change both of their lives entirely. She was going to find out what had broken this man. And then she was going to put him back together, even if he fought her every single step of the way. It had begun 6 weeks earlier with a notice pinned to the board outside the post office in Abilene, which was where Belle had been living with her older brother Thomas and his wife Clara, working as a seamstress and teaching reading to the children of 2 neighboring families. The notice was simple and direct, which Belle later decided said a great deal about its author. It read, "Housekeeper needed for working cattle ranch outside Caldwell. Strong constitution required. Good cooking preferred but not essential. Applied to P. Finley, Box 7, Caldwell Post Office, Kansas." Belle had stood in front of that notice for a long time. She was not running away from anything exactly. That was what she told herself. It was more that she was running toward something, toward a life that felt like her own, toward space and purpose and the kind of clean prairie air that did not carry the particular weight of her sister-in-law's pity. Clara was a kind woman, genuinely kind, but kindness delivered in the form of constant gentle suggestions about eligible bachelors and quiet comments about how a woman of Belle's intelligence surely did not want to spend her whole life as a seamstress carried its own particular sting. Belle was 23. She had survived the death of her mother at 16, the subsequent year spent holding her family together while her father grieved himself into the bottom of a whiskey bottle, and the long, slow process of rebuilding something resembling a normal life. She was not fragile. She was not waiting to be saved. She was simply looking for work that felt like it meant something. She wrote to P. Finley. His reply came in 11 days, which she later learned was unusually fast for him, since he was not a man given to communication for its own sake. The letter was 5 sentences long. It stated the wage, which was fair. It stated the working conditions, which were basic. It stated that the position was living as the ranch was 17 miles from town. It stated that he expected honest work and would provide honest pay. It stated that she could arrive on the 15th of September if she chose to accept. It did not say please. It did not say he hoped she would come. It did not include a single word of warmth or welcome. Belle accepted immediately. She arrived on the 15th of September 1882 on the afternoon stage from Abilene, carrying one large trunk, one carpet bag, and the cast iron skillet that had belonged to her mother. Thomas had driven her to the stage and held both her hands for a long moment before she climbed up, his face carrying that particular mixture of worry and helpless love that brothers sometimes wore when they suspected their sisters were about to do something inadvisable. "You do not have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why I want to." The Finley Ranch sat in a broad, shallow valley about 17 miles southwest of Caldwell, close enough to the Chicaskia River that the land was good, and the grass ran green well into October most years. The main house was a solid two-story structure built from local limestone, which was common in that part of southern Kansas, with a wide front porch and 4 outbuildings visible from the road. It was not beautiful, but it was serious and sturdy, and looked like it had been built to last by someone who intended to stay. The man who came out to meet the stage was not what she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected precisely. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair going slightly long at the collar and gray eyes the color of the sky just before a plain storm. He was broad through the shoulders and lean through the waist, and he moved with the economical, unhurried precision of a man who had spent a great deal of his life working with animals. He was wearing a plain canvas work shirt and dusty trousers, and his boots were the boots of a man who actually worked in them rather than wearing them for appearance. He looked at her, then at her trunk, then at her mother's cast iron skillet, and something that might have been faint surprise crossed his face before it was replaced by the neutral, careful expression that she would come to know very well. "Miss Fletcher," he said. "Mr. Finley," she said. He picked up her trunk with the ease of a man lifting a saddlebag and carried it toward the house without further ceremony. She followed him, the skillet tucked under her arm, looking around at the ranch with the appraising eye of a woman who had managed a household since the age of 16 and knew immediately, walking through that door, 3 things simultaneously. The first was that this house had not been properly cleaned in at least 6 months. The second was that whoever had been cooking here had been doing it badly and without care. The third was that the man walking ahead of her was carrying a weight that had nothing to do with her trunk. She recognized that particular weight. She had seen it on her father. She had felt its echo in herself during the worst years after her mother died. It was the weight of a grief that had not been properly processed or released, that had been instead compressed and sealed and carried forward through sheer force of will until the person bearing it could barely remember what they had felt like before it arrived. She said nothing about any of these 3 things. She set her skillet on the kitchen counter, looked around the room with its cold stove and dusty surfaces and stack of tin plates that had been cleaned without enthusiasm, and said, "I will need a list of what supplies are on hand and what I will need to send for. I would also like to know the meal preferences of yourself and the hands, though I will tell you in advance that I cook what I cook well rather than everything badly, so there may be some negotiation." He looked at her for a moment. "There are 6 hands," he said. "They eat in the bunkhouse mostly. You will cook for them twice a day, breakfast and supper. They do not have preferences that I am aware of." "Everyone has preferences," she said. "They just learn not to mention them when no one is asking." He said nothing. She began opening cupboards. That first week was a careful and largely silent negotiation of territory and expectation. Patrick Finley ran a working cattle ranch with the focused intensity of a man who had decided that work was the only reliable antidote to whatever ailed him. He was up before dawn and out with the hands by first light, and he worked through the day with a thoroughness that his men respected, and his neighbors occasionally found unnerving. He ate the meals that Belle prepared, which were considerably better than anything that had appeared in that kitchen for the better part of a year, and he said very little about them beyond a curt nod that she translated correctly as approval. He did not ask her questions. He did not make conversation at supper beyond the minimum necessary to communicate about ranch operations. He was not unkind. He was simply closed, sealed tight as a well-made jar, and the seal had clearly been in place for long enough that he seemed to have forgotten it was there. Belle, for her part, observed and catalogued. She noticed that there was a photograph on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, a formal portrait of a young woman with light hair and a quiet smile, and that the photograph had been turned slightly so that it faced partly away from the center of the room, as if it had been moved and then not quite moved back, or perhaps moved deliberately so that it was visible only if you stood at a specific angle. She did not ask about it. She noticed that Patrick never went into the back room on the ground floor, the one that had been clearly intended as a nursery, with its single small window and the remnants of pale yellow paint on the walls. The door was always shut. She dusted the hallway around it and did not open it. She noticed that he drank 1 glass of whiskey each evening after supper, exactly 1, poured with the precise measurement of a man who had made a deliberate decision about the quantity, and was holding himself to it with considerable discipline. She noticed that the 6 ranch hands, who were a varied collection of men ranging from old Hector Rays, who had worked cattle since before the war and possessed a vast and gentle wisdom, to young Danny Cho, who was 18 and had arrived from Sacramento the previous spring, and was learning the trade with tremendous enthusiasm and occasional alarming incompetence, treated Patrick with a mixture of genuine respect and careful protectiveness that told her a great deal about the kind of man he had been before whatever had happened. On the 8th day, she asked Hector Rays about it. She asked him while they were both in the yard, she hanging washing and he repairing a section of fence, and she asked it simply and directly because she had found that was usually the best way. "What happened to him?" she said. Hector was quiet for a long time, working a nail into the post with the slow, methodical patience of a man who understood that rushing things did not make them happen faster, only made them happen worse. "His wife," Hector said finally. "And the baby." Belle went still at the wash line. "2 years ago," Hector said. "His wife Sarah, she was with child, there first. She was having a hard time of it toward the end, but the doctor in Caldwell said she was strong and it would go fine." He paused. "It did not go fine. The baby came early. Dr. Marsh was out at the Hendricks place that night, another birth across the county. By the time someone got him, it was already over, Sarah and the baby both." The prairie wind moved through the washing, setting the sheets billowing white against the blue autumn sky. "He built this ranch for her," Hector said. "They had been married 3 years. She used to laugh all the time, and he used to laugh with her. After she died, he just closed up, like a door that got shut and bolted. He drove the last nail in with a single firm stroke. He has been keeping the ranch going. He has been doing his work, but he has not been living, if you take my meaning. He has just been continuing." Belle took her meaning very well. She thought about it for a long time that evening while she made plans for the coming week's meals and wrote out a careful supply list. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to take on this man's grief as a project. She was not his mother or his pastor or his doctor. She was his housekeeper. She was here to cook and clean and manage the domestic operations of a working ranch, not to fix a man who had made his own choices about how to carry his sorrow. She told herself this quite firmly and was almost convinced by it. The trouble was that Belle Fletcher had never in her life been able to stand at the edge of something that needed doing and decide it was not her business. It was, as Thomas had told her many times with a mixture of exasperation and admiration, both her greatest strength and her most reliable source of difficulty. She began, very quietly and without announcing her intentions, to pay attention to the things that seemed to reach him, however slightly. She noticed that he relaxed, minimally but genuinely, when talking to his horses. He had 4 of them, a working string that he rotated through depending on the day's task, and he spoke to them in a low murmur while he worked with them that was entirely different in quality from his normal communication with people. There was something natural and unguarded in it that appeared nowhere else in his daily behavior. She noticed that he occasionally stopped work to watch the prairie when the light was particularly good, at dusk especially, when the Kansas sky did the things that Kansas skies did in autumn that made painters despair, because nothing on a canvas had ever come close to the real thing. She noticed that when Danny Cho did something impressively foolish, which happened with some regularity, there was occasionally a microsecond of expression on Patrick's face that suggested the capacity for humor was not entirely extinct, but simply dormant, like prairie grass in a dry summer, waiting for the right conditions to come back. The biscuit incident happened 6 weeks into her time at the ranch, on a cool November morning when the first serious suggestion of winter was in the air and Belle had decided that the occasion warranted a special breakfast. She had been making excellent biscuits since the age of 14, taught by her mother using a recipe that had come down through 2 generations of Southern women who understood that a properly made biscuit was not merely food, but a demonstration of fundamental competence and care. She had been in the middle of the process when Patrick, crossing through the kitchen for something, had stopped and looked at what she was doing and said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had clearly not intended to say anything but had found it impossible not to, "You are using too much lard." Belle had turned and looked at him. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The ratio. There is too much lard to flour." "My mother used to make them. The ratio was different." "Your mother's biscuits," Belle said carefully, "are not the biscuits I am making. I am simply saying the ratio seems high. I am the one making biscuits, Mr. Finley. I am the one eating them. Then perhaps you would like to make them yourself." The look on his face at this suggestion could only be described as extremely specific alarm, the look of a man who had made a comment that had escalated far beyond what he had intended and now found himself in territory he had not anticipated. "That is not what I said. It is essentially what you implied." "I implied no such thing." "You implied that you know better than me about the proper construction of biscuits, which is a territory I have been navigating successfully for 9 years, and I would like you to show me, specifically, the evidence on which you are basing this critique." He opened his mouth. He closed it. She continued adding lard. It was then, when he had nothing left to say and was clearly recalibrating, that she did the thing she had not planned to do. She picked up the finished biscuit, which had indeed come out badly because the stove temperature had been wrong and she had been distracted by the argument, and she knocked it on the table twice in the way that a carpenter checks wood for density, and she looked at him and said every word about doorstops and weapons and walls that she had said, and she watched the corner of his mouth twitch. She saw it. She saw it clearly. And she did not say a single word about it. She served breakfast. He ate. She cleared the plates. The morning continued. But something had shifted, like the first tiny fracture in spring ice, and they both felt it even if only one of them was paying attention to it. She began leaving small provocations. Not large ones, not obvious ones, just the kind of deliberate, gentle friction that keeps a fire going when it might otherwise go out. She had opinions, which was not unusual, but she began to express them with slightly more directness than strict professional protocol would have suggested, specifically on subjects that she had identified as capable of producing that tiny, involuntary response at the corner of his mouth. She told him quite firmly one morning that his system of organizing the supply shed was irrational and would eventually result in a serious inventory problem. And when he pointed out that the system had worked for 3 years, she said that the system had apparently been working for 3 years in the same way that a fence post works before you discover it is rotten all the way through. That is to say, right up until the moment it stops working entirely. He said nothing, but there was something in the set of his shoulders as he walked away that was fractionally less rigid than usual. She got into an extended discussion with Hector one evening at supper about the best method for treating a horse with a stone bruise, and when she caught Patrick listening from across the kitchen, she turned to him directly and said, "You must have an opinion," and watched him hesitate between his habitual withdrawal and some other impulse before he said, gruffly, "Soaking works better than most people give it credit for." "See," she said to Hector rather than to Patrick, "a reasonable position based on practical experience. That is all I was asking for." She was quite sure she saw it again then. Barely, but there. November deepened and the days grew cold and sharp and clean. The ranch shifted into its winter operations, the cattle brought in closer to the sheltered pastures, the work changing character from the constant motion of the driving season to the steadier rhythms of maintenance and preparation. The hands spent more time in the bunkhouse in the evenings. Belle spent more time in the kitchen. Patrick spent more time in the house. It was not something he seemed to choose deliberately. It was more as if the shortening days and the cold drove him incrementally inward, and the kitchen was warm, and she was in it, and increasingly the kitchen was a place where things happened that were at least slightly more interesting than sitting alone in the sitting room with one glass of whiskey and a ledger. She did not call attention to this pattern. She simply continued to be present and engaged, and occasionally infuriating on subjects that she had identified as capable of producing a response. She was in the middle of a monologue about the superior organizational logic of her new system for the dry goods pantry, which she had reorganized twice now, and intended to reorganize a third time in a way that she was quite confident would finally achieve what she was after when she heard the sound. It was small. It was brief. It was the sound of a man clearing his throat in a way that had very little to do with his throat, and rather more to do with suppressing something that his face was trying to do without his permission. She stopped mid-sentence and looked at him. He was looking at the window. His jaw was working slightly in the way of a man fighting a losing battle. "Mr. Finley," she said. "I am listening," he said, in a voice that was just slightly not his normal voice. "Are you all right? I am perfectly fine. You sound peculiar." "I do not sound peculiar. You are making a sound." "I am not making a sound." "You are making a sound like a man who has swallowed something that disagrees with him." The sound came again, and this time it was unmistakable, and it came fully out into the open air of the kitchen before he could stop it, and it was a laugh. It was short and rusty, and slightly alarmed by its own existence. The laugh of a mechanism that had not been used in a very long time, and was not entirely sure it still functioned correctly. But it was a laugh, fully and completely and without question. He stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them in that moment that had the quality of a door opening. Not wide, not dramatically, just the way a door opens when the latch releases and the pressure from one side is finally greater than the force holding it shut. Just enough that light comes through from the other side. He looked away. "The system makes no sense," he said, his voice very careful. "It makes perfect sense," she said just as carefully. "I will explain it to you again." She did. He listened. He did not laugh again that evening, but neither did he leave the kitchen, and he asked 2 questions about the dry goods system that were entirely genuine questions asked by a man who had decided, somewhere in the last several minutes, that engaging was preferable to retreating. She lay awake that night in her upstairs room listening to the wind moving across the plains and thought about the sound of that laugh, and felt something in her own chest that she had not expected to feel when she had accepted a position as housekeeper on a cattle ranch in Kansas. She told herself it was too soon. She told herself she did not know this man. She told herself that a woman in her position, employed in his household, dependent on his continued goodwill for her income and her shelter, had very sound practical reasons for keeping the boundary between professional regard and personal feeling clearly defined. She told herself all of these things, and they were all true, and none of them made the slightest difference to what she was feeling. She was in trouble, and she knew it, and she decided that the best response to trouble, as it had always been, was to move forward through it with both eyes open. December arrived with a genuine blizzard, the first real one of the season, a 2-day event that covered the Kansas plains in 3 feet of snow and drove the temperature down to places that made a person respect the land in a very fundamental way. The ranch went into the kind of enforced stillness that frontier winters produced, the hands in the bunkhouse, the cattle in the sheltered pasture, and the main house wrapped in white. On the second day of the blizzard, with the wind still throwing snow horizontally past the windows, Belle was making soup from the last of the autumn root vegetables, and a smoked bone she had been saving for exactly this kind of occasion when Patrick came in from the barn, where he had gone to check on the horses despite her expressed opinion that this was unnecessarily dangerous given the conditions. He was covered in snow, his coat white with it, his face reddened by the wind, and he was holding his left hand in a way that told her immediately something was wrong with it. She set down her spoon and crossed the kitchen. "What happened?" "Nothing of consequence," he said. "Let me see it." "It is not serious." Patrick. She had used his name, not his title, and he stopped at the sound of it. "Let me see it." He held it out. She took it in both of hers and examined it with careful hands. It was not broken, she thought, but there was a laceration on the palm, clean and deep, from what looked like a piece of broken wood or metal, and it had bled considerably and was still doing so. "Sit down," she said. "Belle, sit down. I will get the medical kit." She said it with exactly enough authority that he sat down. She brought water and clean cloth and the small medical kit she had organized shortly after her arrival, and she cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency, having dealt with the injuries of ranch life often enough in the past that the procedure was automatic. What was not automatic was the fact that she was holding his hand carefully, and he was letting her, and neither of them was saying anything. His hands were large and calloused and bare-scratched from decades of work, and there was something very human and very real about them, something that made the abstract idea of this person she had been carefully observing for 2 months into a much more immediate and specific thing. She finished. She tied off the bandage. She did not immediately release his hand. He looked down at their hands and then up at her face. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the careful neutral tone he normally deployed. "You should not have gone out in that," she said. "The horses needed checking. The horses would have been fine for another few hours. I know them. I know you know them. You are still not invincible." She did release his hand then and stepped back, and the ordinary air of the kitchen came back around them, and he looked at his bandaged hand for a moment and then said, "You have been out here before. You knew what you were doing with that. My father ran a small farm outside Abilene. My mother kept the household. When she died, I kept it instead. There were 3 of us younger than Thomas, and my father was not always reliable about practical matters during those years. I learned what I needed to learn." He was quiet for a moment. "How old were you?" 16. Another quiet. The blizzard threw itself against the window. "That is a great deal to take on at 16, he said. "Yes," she said. It was. She picked up her spoon and went back to the soup. "But it taught me that I was capable of more than I had thought, which I consider to be a reasonable return on a very difficult investment." She heard, behind her, the specific sound of a man absorbing something, not thinking about it exactly, but absorbing it the way dry ground absorbs the first rain, letting it go deep rather than running it off. "The soup will be ready in an hour," she said. "You should go change out of those wet things or you will have more trouble than a cut hand." He went. She stirred the pot and did not think about how his voice had sounded when he said thank you, and also she thought about nothing else for the entire hour that remained until supper. The weeks after the blizzard had a different quality from the weeks before it. Something had shifted in the careful distance that Patrick maintained, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that she could feel it. He stopped leaving the kitchen as quickly as he had before. He began to ask questions, small ones at first, practical ones, about the supply situation and the pantry organization, but gradually questions that had nothing to do with ranch operations at all. He asked her one evening about what she had been reading, having noticed the book on the table that she had brought in from her room, and she said it was Darwin, and she watched his expression go through several interesting phases before he said he had not read Darwin, and she said she could leave it for him when she finished, and he said he might look at it, in the tone of a man who is not going to look at something but is not prepared to say so directly. He looked at it. She knew because she found it in the sitting room 2 mornings later at a different page than she had left it, and there was a small piece of folded paper tucked in as a bookmark that had not been there before. She said nothing about this. She began to talk more during meals, not filling silence for the sake of filling it, but bringing things she had thought about during the day, observations about the ranch, questions about the history of the land, comments about the news that came in on the weekly paper that Hector brought in from town. Patrick did not initiate conversation, but he answered, and his answers gradually became longer and more complete, and occasionally he added something that she had not asked for, an additional piece of information, a context, a memory. It was on one of these evenings, in the middle of a conversation about the changes that the railroad had brought to the cattle trade, that she discovered he had once wanted to study law. She had not expected this. She had been finding out who he was in layers, the way you peel back the layers of something to find out what is at the center, and this particular layer surprised her. Law, she said. Before the war. I was 17. My father had a friend who was an attorney in Topeka, and I thought possibly I would go to read law with him when I was old enough. He paused, turning his glass slightly in his fingers. The war changed the plan. After the war I came back and there was the ranch to manage. My father's health was poor, and the other plan simply did not happen. Do you regret it? He thought about this for what she appreciated was a genuine length of time, not a reflexive social response. I did for a while, he said. Now I think a man has to make his peace with the life he has rather than the one he imagined. The ranch is mine and I understand it and it matters, in the way that things you have built and maintained and fought for matter. He paused again. But there are times in the evenings, reading, when I think I might have been reasonable at it. I think you would have been excellent at it, she said, and she meant it, because she had watched him reason through problems with a clarity and fairness that she found genuinely impressive, and the idea of that mind applied to argument and law was not difficult to imagine. He looked at her across the table. Why do you say that, he said, and it was not a social question. He genuinely wanted to know. Because you are precise, she said. You think before you speak, you weigh things, and you are fair. I have seen you be fair to people who did not necessarily deserve it. That could also describe stubbornness. Stubbornness and fairness are first cousins, she said. The difference is whether the principle you are holding to is worth holding to. He said nothing, but the way he was looking at her had something in it that she felt through her whole chest. She cleared the table and went to the kitchen and washed the dishes and told herself firmly to be sensible. Christmas arrived in a way she had not expected. She had assumed that Christmas on this particular ranch would be acknowledged and then quietly ignored, which had seemed consistent with the general character of its owner. Instead, Hector and the Hands appeared on Christmas morning with a small pine tree they had dragged in from the creek bottom, which they installed in the sitting room with considerable ceremony, and decorated with whatever came to hand. Strips of red cloth and some brass buttons and several items of unclear origin that were clearly traditional among the bunkhouse crew. Patrick appeared in the sitting room doorway, looked at the tree, looked at the men, and said, I see. It is Christmas, boss, Danny Cho said, with the genuine brightness of someone for whom Christmas was still entirely uncomplicated. Patrick looked at the tree for another moment. Yes, he said, it is. Belle made a Christmas dinner that was, by any reasonable standard, a serious undertaking. She had been planning it for 2 weeks, had made arrangements with Hector who made arrangements in Caldwell for specific items, and the result was a table that the ranch house had not seen in at least 2 years, probably more. A proper roasted chicken, sweet potatoes, dried apple pie, cornbread made with the correct proportion of fat, a fact she did not mention to Patrick. The hands ate in the bunkhouse with their own version of the same spread, and it was Patrick and Belle who sat down at the table in the main house, which she realized only as they were sitting down was something that had become perfectly ordinary and also something that would have been entirely unusual 2 months ago. Patrick looked at the table for a moment before he sat down. "You did not need to do all this," he said. "It is Christmas," she said. "Of course I did." He sat. She sat. He poured them both a small glass of the wine she had arranged for, which was not common territory for either of them, but which felt appropriate to the occasion. He raised his glass slightly. "Christmas," he said. "To Christmas," she agreed. They ate and it was good, and the house felt different than it usually felt, warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the stove, and partway through the meal he said, in the tone of a man saying something he had been considering saying for some time, "Sarah used to make cornbread on Christmas. She had her own recipe. I think she would have found it funny, the argument about the biscuits." Belle went very still. It was the first time he had said her name to Belle. She knew from Hector what the name was, and she had known for months what the shape of the loss was, but hearing him say it was different. It was the first small opening of the sealed room. "Tell me about her," Belle said, quietly, carefully. He looked at his glass. "She was from Ohio," he said. "She came out with her family when she was 15, and we met when she was 20 and I was 27. She had a laugh you could hear 3 fields away. She thought the prairie was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen." He paused. "She wanted children very much. We were married 3 years before the first pregnancy, and she was overjoyed. She was not afraid. She kept saying everything would be fine." He turned his glass. "She was wrong, but she was not afraid, and I have always thought that was a kind of bravery I did not fully understand until it was gone." Belle said, "She sounds like someone worth missing." He looked up. "Yes," he said, she is." He was quiet for a moment. "I think for a long time I confused honoring her memory with refusing to continue living, as if being alive was somehow disloyal." Belle thought about this carefully before she answered. "I think that is a very human confusion. And I think she would probably have had words to say about it." Something very small happened at the corner of his mouth. "She would have had quite a few words to say about it," he said. "She was not a woman who kept her opinions to herself." "A quality I have some familiarity with," Belle said. This time it was complete and unmistakable, a full, quiet smile, not the rusty, alarmed laugh of the biscuit incident, but something deeper and steadier, the kind of smile that lives in a person's whole face rather than just the surface of it. Belle felt it like a hand pressed over her heart. They finished the meal and she cleared up and he helped, which he had never done before, carrying plates to the kitchen without being asked. And when they were done, she said good night and went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about how in 9 years of managing households and people and difficult situations, she had never once found herself in a position of such genuine and complicated feeling about someone she was supposed to be working for. She thought about Sarah. She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece and the closed nursery door, and the 2 years of closed-up grief, and the way one Christmas dinner had opened something that had been shut so long it had nearly become permanent. She thought about the fact that she was in love with Patrick Finley, and that this was either the most natural thing that had ever happened to her or a disaster in the making, and that the difference between those two outcomes was entirely unclear. She thought about this for a long time, and then she slept, and in the morning she got up and made breakfast, and he was at the table when she came down, which he was beginning to be more consistently, and he poured 2 cups of coffee, one of which he left for her, and she looked at that cup and felt the specific warmth of being considered by someone who was being careful about it. January came in cold and clear and uncompromising. The ranch work in January was unglamorous and demanding, mending and maintenance, and watching the cattle through the long cold nights when a sudden drop in temperature could mean losses that a working operation could not afford. Patrick was out more than usual and Belle kept the house warm and the food ready, and occupied herself with the things that a household of this kind needed during a hard winter: mending, inventory, planning for spring. She had been exchanging letters with Thomas throughout, and in January she received one that disrupted the steady rhythm of her days. Thomas wrote that their father was ill, seriously enough that the doctor had been called twice in the past week, and that he was not sure Belle should not come home. She went to Patrick with the letter. He read it the first time he had read anything personal of hers, and his expression when he looked up was not the careful neutral of the early months but something more direct and real. "How serious does he think it is?" he asked. Thomas does not tend toward exaggeration. If he says the doctor has been twice, it is serious. "Then you should go." She looked at him. The household will manage. It has managed before." He paused. "Your family needs you, Belle." It was the first time he had used her name without formal address since the blizzard, and she heard it and he heard it, and neither of them mentioned it. "I will go for 2 weeks," she said. "If it is not resolved, I will write." He nodded. He looked at the letter again briefly, then handed it back. "I will have Danny take you to the stage in the morning." She left the next morning. She did not look back at the ranch as the wagon took her toward the road, and this was because she was fairly sure that if she did look back she would see him standing on the porch watching her go, and she did not know what she would do with that. She was right that it was serious. Her father had suffered a genuine respiratory illness, aggravated by years of hard living and the particular cold of an Abilene January, and he was bedridden and frightened in a way that she had not seen him frightened since her mother died. Belle took over the management of the sick room with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, and she sat with him in the evenings and read to him and let him talk about her mother, which was what he most needed. Her father, whose name was George Fletcher and who was 58 and looked older, reached out one evening and took her hand and said, with the directness that illness sometimes produces in people who have spent their healthy lives avoiding it, "You are happy, Belle. Whatever this job is, it is making you happy." She opened her mouth to give him a reasonable and measured response and discovered she did not have one. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. Not all of it, not the complicated interior layers, but enough. The ranch, the man, the 2 years of grief being slowly and carefully unknotted, the biscuit argument and the first laugh, the Christmas dinner and the name said aloud. Her father listened, and his face did the thing that aging fathers' faces do when they hear their daughters talk about someone in that particular register, something between hope and caution and the very specific helplessness of loving someone you cannot protect. "A man who is learning to live again is not a finished man," he said. "You understand that?" "I do," she said. "You could get hurt." "I know. You are going anyway." She pressed her father's hand. "I am." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have liked the sound of him." "I think so too," she said. Her father recovered. It took 10 days, and the second week he was sitting up and eating properly and complaining about the quality of Thomas's coffee, which Belle took as a reliable indicator of genuine improvement. She wrote to Patrick on the 9th day to tell him she would return as planned on the 15th. His reply came the day before she left. It was longer than his usual letters. It began with a practical account of the ranch situation during her absence, which was characteristically him, but then it went on to say that the supply order she had arranged before leaving had arrived, and that Hector had organized it as per her instructions, and that Danny had broken a window in the bunkhouse through an incident that did not reflect well on anyone involved but particularly not on Danny, and that the Darwin book was excellent. That was all. But the Darwin book was excellent was 3 words beyond anything strictly necessary, and she read them 5 times and put the letter in her carpetbag with a composure she was quite proud of. She arrived back on the 15th afternoon. Patrick came to meet the stage himself, not Danny, and she saw him standing at the hitching post outside the Caldwell stage office, and something in her chest did a thing she had long since stopped pretending was not happening. He looked different to her after 2 weeks. She had been seeing him every day for months, and somewhere in that familiarity she had stopped seeing him in the way you stop really seeing a landscape you pass through constantly. Now, after an absence, she saw him again properly, the height of him and the gray eyes and the way he stood, and all the things she had learned about who he was behind that careful face. And she thought, I am in very serious trouble. Your father is better, he said when she stepped down from the stage. It was not a question. He is, she said. Thank you for allowing me to go. You did not need my permission, he said. You needed me to tell you the ranch would not fall apart, which it has not. Has Danny broken anything else? The right corner of his mouth moved. Nothing significant. She collected her bag. He collected her trunk. They walked to the wagon and he helped her up into it, and they drove the 17 miles back to the ranch in a silence that was nothing like the silence of their first drive, which had been the silence of strangers, but instead the comfortable, warm silence of two people who know each other well enough that words are optional. Halfway home she said, I am glad it was you who came. He looked at the road ahead. So am I, he said. February was the month that things changed properly. It happened gradually and then all at once, in the way that most things do. It happened in the form of an evening when the snow had finally relented, and they were sitting in the sitting room after supper, she reading and he working through the ranch accounts, and the fire was going well, and the house was warm and comfortable, and she looked up from her book and found him looking at her. Not the careful appraising look of the early months, not the look of a man making a professional assessment. The look of a man who has been watching someone for a while and has stopped being careful about the fact that he is doing so. She held his gaze. He did not look away. Belle, he said. Yes, she said. I want to ask you something. All right, she said. He closed the ledger. He set it aside. He looked at his hands for a moment in the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts, and then he looked up. I know that you came here as an employee, he said. I know that the arrangement between us has been professional. I'm not interested in doing anything to compromise your situation or to put you in a position of difficulty, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, the position is yours as long as you want it. She waited. I have been finding for some months now that I think about you in ways that are not strictly professional, he said, with the precision of a man who has rehearsed this and is holding to the rehearsed version because improvising would terrify him. And I think you are aware of this, and I think it would be dishonest to continue pretending otherwise. So I am asking you directly whether my thinking about it in this way is something that you would like me to stop, or whether it might not be entirely unwelcome. Belle looked at him. She thought about her father saying a man who is learning to live again is not a finished man. She thought about the biscuit knocking on the table and the rusty alarmed laugh in the Darwin book is excellent and the 2 cups of coffee in the morning. She said, It is not unwelcome, Patrick. It has not been unwelcome for quite some time. He exhaled slowly like a man who has been holding his breath for longer than was good for him. Good, he said, and then after a pause, I am not certain I know how to do this properly anymore. I should tell you that honestly. That is all right, she said. I do not require you to do it perfectly. I require you to try it genuinely. That I can do, he said. And he smiled at her fully and completely, the kind of smile that she had been collecting fragments of for months and had never yet seen whole. And it was exactly what she had suspected it would be, the kind of smile that changed the whole architecture of a face, that made clear what the face had been built to do when it was not holding everything in. She thought about Hector saying he used to laugh all the time. She could believe that now. She could see it. She smiled back. Outside, the Kansas winter was doing all the things Kansas winters do, relentless and beautiful, and entirely indifferent to the happiness or sorrow of the people in the houses set across its vast cold face. Inside the Finley ranch house, a fire burned in the grate and 2 people began, carefully and genuinely, to find out who they were to each other. What followed was not a sudden or dramatic transformation, but something more real and more lasting, a gradual unfolding of 2 people who had both spent years being their own best company, and were finding, to their considerable surprise, that another person's company was not the compromise they had assumed it to be, but something rather better than what they had managed alone. He began bringing her small things. Not gifts in the showy sense, but the kind of small, deliberate attentions that mean more than expensive gestures, because they require paying attention to specific details of a specific person. He brought her a book from the general store in Caldwell that the storekeeper had told him was something women often liked, and it was a novel she had been wanting to read for 2 years, which meant that at some point he had been listening carefully enough to information she had not known she was providing. He told her this as he handed it to her, awkwardly, the way a man tells you something true that makes him feel slightly vulnerable. She kept the book on her nightstand for the rest of her life. He started taking her out riding on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, not as a grand gesture, but as a natural extension of the fact that she needed to know the land she was managing supplies for, and he knew the land and wanted to show it to her. But what happened on those rides was that she fell in love with the landscape in the way he had always loved it. The vast open running plains and the creek bottoms with their cottonwoods and the particular quality of the sky above southern Kansas. And watching someone fall in love with something you love is its own kind of intimacy. She told him about her mother properly, in the way she had not told anyone in a long time, because he had told her about Sarah, and she understood that the exchange of these histories was what it meant to actually know someone. She told him about the farm and the seamstress work and the years of holding things together, and he listened the way she had come to know he listened, with his whole attention, nothing reserved. And afterward he said, "You are one of the least fragile people I have ever met." "That is not precisely a romantic compliment," she said. "I mean it as one," he said. She thought about it. "All right," she said, "I will take it as one." He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday in late February, at the end of one of their afternoon rides, when they had stopped at the top of the low rise that gave the best view of the whole valley, and sat their horses for a while, watching the last light go golden across the grass. She said something about the color of the light, and he said something about how it was different every evening even when it looked the same. And she turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her. And he said her name once, and she leaned slightly toward him, and he kissed her, carefully, briefly, with complete intention. It was the kind of first kiss that has no performance in it, only the quiet, genuine fact of two people deciding at the same moment that this was true. He pulled back and looked at her. "I should like to court you properly," he said, which was not at all what she had expected him to say and was therefore entirely perfect. "Then do so," she said. He did. The spring of 1883 on the Finley ranch was marked by the somewhat bemused observation of 6 ranch hands who had not expected to see their employer doing anything so domestic as walking with a woman in the evening or appearing at the dinner table, with something approaching animation in his expression. Hector watched all of it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to see a particular thing, and was finding the reality of it exactly as good as he had hoped. Danny Cho was openly delighted, and made absolutely no attempt to conceal this, which Patrick addressed with a direct but not unkind conversation about professional restraint, which Danny respected for approximately 4 days before reverting. The spring was full and productive. The cattle came through the winter in better shape than Patrick had expected, which meant the spring roundup was approached with something approaching optimism rather than simple determination. Belle managed the ranch household with the confidence of a woman who has mastered her territory, expanding the kitchen garden that had been badly neglected, establishing a supply system that actually worked, and beginning to develop the kind of relationship with the land around the ranch that came from genuinely paying attention to it. She and Patrick fell into a rhythm that felt ancient and right, the rhythm of two people whose daily lives have become braided together so thoroughly that the idea of unbraiding them becomes difficult to contemplate. They argued regularly about practical things and impractical things, about ranch management and historical facts, and whether certain books were better than other books, and whether the dry goods pantry had achieved its final and correct form yet, which Belle's position was that it had not, and Patrick's position was that there had been 7 reorganizations, and at some point a system had to be considered finalized. The arguments were never frightening. They were the arguments of two people who trust each other well enough to be honest, and they almost always ended with someone laughing, usually Patrick, and this was still something she found quietly remarkable, the laugh that had been so absent and was now present with regularity, the laugh that had first appeared as a ghost, and was now something full and real and built into the ordinary texture of the days. In April he asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen, which was not what either of them would have planned if they had been planning it, but neither of them had planned it exactly. It was a Sunday evening and she was making the final preparations for a pie, and he was sitting at the table reading the paper and she was talking about something. She couldn't remember afterward what, and he put the paper down and looked at her and said, "I want you to marry me, Belle." She set down the rolling pin. She turned around. He was looking at her with everything visible in his face, all the things that he had gradually, over the past months, learned to let be visible, the feeling and the fear, and the specific vulnerable honesty of a man who has loved and lost and chosen to love again anyway, which is a braver thing by far than loving for the first time. "I know what I am asking," he said. "I know I am not simple. I know I carry things. I know I will frustrate you, and I know you will argue with me about it, which is its own comfort, believe it or not. But I want to make this my life with you in it properly, not as an employee, as my wife, if you will have me." Belle Fletcher had not cried once in the 6 months she had been on the Finley ranch, and she was not going to cry now, and she was absolutely crying now. She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him clearly. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes, you foolish man." He laughed, and she kissed him, and the pie was somewhat delayed but was excellent when it eventually emerged. They married in May of 1883, in Caldwell, in the small church near the center of town, with the minister who had been serving that congregation for 12 years and who had also performed the funeral for Sarah Finley, and therefore felt the particular weight and significance of this occasion with considerable depth. Thomas Fletcher came from Abilene with Clara and brought their father George, who had recovered well from the winter illness and who sat in the front row and cried with an openness that Belle found both mortifying and deeply touching. Hector Ray stood with Patrick, as he had always stood with him, through all of it. Danny Cho was also present and was extremely emotional about the whole thing, which he managed with the energetic transparency of a young man who had not yet learned to conceal his feelings. Belle wore her mother's earrings and a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered 6 weeks prior, a deep blue calico that was not a traditional wedding dress but was very much her. Patrick wore a suit that he had clearly made in Caldwell because it fit him properly, and was not the work clothes she was accustomed to seeing him in. And when she came into the church and he turned and saw her, the expression on his face was the kind of expression that a woman stores carefully and keeps for the rest of her life. They made their vows, and the minister spoke about new beginnings and the specific courage of love that chooses to continue, and Belle thought that this man knew whereof he spoke, and she was grateful for it. Afterward there was a small gathering at the ranch, which Belle had organized because there was no version of an event connected to her that was not going to be well organized, and it extended into the evening with considerable warmth and the kind of celebration that working people in hard country produce when they decide to really celebrate, which is to say, full-hearted and without reservation. At one point in the evening, Belle found herself standing with Hector at the edge of the gathering, looking at Patrick across the yard, where he was talking to Thomas with an ease that told her the conversation was going well, and Hector said quietly, "I have not seen him this way in a very long time." "What way?" she asked. "Present," Hector said simply. She looked at Patrick and thought about all the ways that described what she had been watching happen over the past months. A man returning to himself from a very long distance, finding his way back to the world through the ordinary accumulated details of shared days, biscuits and arguments and Darwin books and Sunday rides and 2 cups of coffee in the morning. He did most of it himself, she said. He needed someone to leave the door open, Hector said. She thought that was probably right. The summer of 1883 was a good one for the Finley ranch. The spring cattle drive had gone better than expected, and the prices in Caldwell had been fair, which meant the books were in better shape than they had been in several years. Patrick made two decisions that summer that indicated, to anyone watching, that he was thinking about the future differently than he had been before. He invested in improvements to the south pasture that would not see their full return for 2 or 3 seasons. He also began, quietly and without announcement, to clear out the room with the pale yellow paint. Belle came home one afternoon from a trip to Caldwell to find him in that room with the door open. She stopped in the hallway. He had opened the window. The summer air was moving through the room, which had been sealed for 2 years, and he was standing in the middle of it, not doing anything in particular, simply standing in it with the window open. He heard her and turned. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at his face and saw the complicated truth of what it cost him to stand in that room, and she also saw that he was standing in it deliberately, with full knowledge of what it cost, because he had decided to. "I thought," he said, "that we might want it for something." She crossed the hallway and took his hand. They stood in the yellow room together for a while with the summer air coming through the window, and then they went downstairs, and she made supper and they ate, and he talked about the south pasture improvements, and she talked about the new garden bed she wanted to add, and outside the Kansas evening did its extraordinary things with light and color across the plain. By October she was certain she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday evening, the same time of day, and almost the same location where he had asked her to marry him, because she believed in the significance of domestic geography, that the places where important things happen accumulate a kind of meaning. She told him directly as she told him everything. He was very still for a moment. She watched his face move through things, watched all the history of it moving through him, the joy and the fear tangled so tightly together that she could not separate them in his expression, and probably he could not separate them in himself. She said, "I am not Sarah." He looked at her. "I am strong," she said. "I am healthy. The doctor in Caldwell is not the only doctor available to us, and we will know well in advance exactly what preparations to make. I am not afraid, Patrick, and I need you to find a way to not be afraid either, or at least to not let the fear make the decisions." He was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said finally. "I know you know," she said. "I am saying it anyway." He reached out and took her face in both hands, his careful large hands, the ones she had bandaged in the blizzard of their second month together, and he held her face and looked at her for a moment with everything visible. "You are the bravest person I know," he said. "I thought I was the least fragile," she said. "They are the same thing," he said. And he kissed her, long and slow, and with the full weight of who he was and all he felt behind it. The pregnancy was uncomplicated. Belle made that her project, approaching it with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything, identifying the best doctor in the region, which required some research and resulted in the securing of Dr. Elaine Marsh from Wichita, who was the wife of a doctor and a formidable medical practitioner in her own right, something that was unusual but not entirely unknown in Kansas in 1883. She arranged for Dr. Marsh to be available well in advance of the due date and established a clear protocol for communication that left nothing to the uncertainty that had claimed Sarah. Patrick watched all of this and helped where he could and worried quietly and well, not in the paralyzing way he had feared he would, but in the productive way of a man who turns worry into preparation, which was one of the things she loved about him. He also, she noticed, talked to Sarah. She knew because once, coming downstairs earlier than usual, she found him in the sitting room with the photograph in his hands, not the half-turned version on the mantelpiece but holding it, and saying something quietly. She went back upstairs and came down again with more noise, and when she appeared in the sitting room the photograph was back in its place, and he was standing at the window, and she said good morning and he said good morning, and nothing further was mentioned. She thought about it and decided that it was exactly right. that this was a man who was carrying both his love for the woman he had lost and his love for the woman he had found, and that these were not in competition, that love was not a substance in finite supply that diminished in one place when it was added to another, and that she had always understood this but was glad that he had found his own way to it. She moved the photograph to a place that faced the room properly. In May of 1884, a boy was born. He arrived in the early morning of a warm spring day with a good breeze coming through the open windows and Dr. Marsh present and prepared and entirely competent. And it was neither easy nor terrifying, but simply the ordinary, enormous, extraordinary experience of a child entering the world. Patrick, who had been clear-eyed and useful throughout, which Belle had insisted upon and for which she would always be grateful, held his son for the first time in the gray early morning light and looked at this new person with an expression that words don't really approach. Belle, exhausted and entirely satisfied, watched him. He looked up at her. "Hello," he said, which was clearly addressed to her but also somewhat to the general universe. "Hello yourself," she said. "He is very small." "He will grow," she said. "That is rather the point." He looked back at the baby, and something in his face was open in a way that she thought might be new even for him. New in the way that things are new when they take you further than you thought you could go, further into the territory of love that is also risk. That is also the specific courage of people who have known loss and loved again anyway. They named him William George Finley. William for Patrick's father, George for hers. Hector held the baby on the afternoon of the second day, and was entirely undone by this in the way that tough old men with long histories sometimes are by small new things. And he said, in Spanish, something that Belle asked him to translate, and he said it meant more or less that the ground is solid again, which she thought was exactly right. Danny Cho, who had been waiting outside the house for approximately 14 hours despite repeated instructions to go back to the bunkhouse, was permitted to view the baby from the doorway, and responded with an enthusiasm that woke William, which produced a sound that was extraordinary in its volume for something so small, and which made Danny apologize repeatedly and Patrick, holding his son, laugh. It was the pure, uncomplicated laugh of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was built to do, which was love the people in his house and work the land he had built and meet each day as it came. Belle heard that laugh and thought about the biscuit on the table and the rusty surprise thing that had come from him that morning, and how far both of them had traveled from that moment to this one. She thought it was, by any reasonable standard, quite a distance. Summer came again to the Kansas plains, big and golden and demanding, the way summer always came to that country, with heat and light and the constant work of keeping things alive. The ranch was doing well. The south pasture improvements Patrick had made the previous year were paying the dividends he had calculated. Danny Cho had become, through the slow education of hard work and Hector's patient instruction, a genuinely competent hand. Hector himself was beginning to speak of possibly visiting his daughter in New Mexico in the coming year, which was the closest thing to a retirement plan Belle had ever heard him mention. William George Finley grew with the relentless efficiency of healthy children, and was by all accounts exactly what a first child should be, which was primarily an education in the fact that you knew far less about everything than you had thought before you had one. He had dark hair like his father and eyes that had not yet settled on their final color, though they showed every indication of ending up gray. He had very definite opinions about what he wanted, and was not shy about communicating them, which his mother found gratifying, and his father found occasionally exhausting and overall fair. Belle wrote to her father regularly, and her father wrote back with letters that had improved considerably in quality over the months of his recovery, finding in correspondence something that his earlier years had not provided. He came to visit in the autumn of 1884 and spent 2 weeks at the ranch, and spent a great deal of time on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset across the plains with the quiet satisfaction of an old man who has lived long enough to see things come right. On the last evening of his visit, he said to Patrick, in the direct way that illness and age had given him, "You have made my daughter happy. I want you to know that I see that." Patrick said, "She has made me considerably more than that." George Fletcher looked at him and then nodded once, in the way that men of his generation sometimes said the important things, with a compression that contained a great deal. Thomas and Clara came at Christmas, and it was the kind of Christmas that becomes a reference point, the one that other Christmases are compared to afterward, with the ranch full of people and William pulling himself around the floor with considerable determination, and Patrick at the head of the table with an ease and warmth in him that Thomas, who had never met the man he had been before, would simply have called his nature, while Hector, who had known him through all of it, watched quietly and was grateful. In the new year, 1885, they hired a young woman named Rosa Reyes, Hector's niece, who came up from New Mexico to help Belle with the house and the baby, and who brought with her a cooking tradition that Belle engaged with genuine interest and enthusiasm, and which produced several months of experimental meals that the hands received with varying degrees of willingness but general appreciation. Belle's garden expanded that spring. She had been thinking about it over the winter and had plans that were specific and detailed, and which Patrick looked at with the expression he had for her detailed plans, which was a combination of mild skepticism and certain knowledge that the skepticism was going to turn out to be wrong. He was wrong about the skepticism. The garden by midsummer of 1885 was producing enough vegetables that she was able to trade surplus at the general store in Caldwell, and had begun a limited business supplying produce to 2 restaurants in town, which was not something Patrick had expected, but which he supported without reservation, because it was hers, and it was working, and it made her face do the specific thing it did when she was engaged in something that fully occupied her considerable capabilities. Hector did go to New Mexico in the spring of 1885, as planned, to visit his daughter. He returned in the fall, which surprised no one, because the Finley ranch was his home in all the ways that mattered, and he had always known he would come back. He came back with his daughter Maria and her husband and their 2 children, which was not what anyone had planned, but which was received with the open hospitality of a household that had learned that there was room for the people who belonged. By the autumn of 1885, 3 years after Belle Fletcher had arrived on the stage from Abilene with her trunk and her carpetbag and her mother's cast-iron skillet, the Finley ranch was a different place from the one she had stepped off into that September afternoon. Not different in the physical sense, the same limestone house and 4 outbuildings and broad shallow valley and the Chicaskia River running green to the south. Different in the sense that a house is different when it is actually lived in, when it accumulates the density of a life being properly conducted, of people who belong to each other and to a place, and who meet each day with the full knowledge of what they have and what it cost and what it means. The photograph of Sarah Finley on the mantelpiece faced the room. The nursery room had become William's room, painted a fresh white with the remnants of the yellow carefully preserved on one wall, which was Belle's idea, because she thought that history should not be painted over but incorporated, because it was part of the structure that held everything else up. Patrick was not the same man who had stood across a kitchen table telling her the ratio of lard to flour was wrong in the cool November of 1882. He was not different in his essential character, not different in the precision and the fairness and the careful honesty that were the architecture of who he was. But he was present in himself in a way that he had not been when she arrived, returned from the long distance he had traveled into grief, back to the ordinary, extraordinary daily business of living, which required courage, and which he had in abundance once he had decided to use it. He still sometimes woke at night with the weight of the old loss on him. She knew this, and he knew she knew it, and on those nights she was simply there, which was all that was needed. the warmth of a person who was real and present and alive. He still stood sometimes at the window in the evening in a way that she recognized as private, the particular posture of a man communing with something interior, and she let him have it because privacy was not the same as distance, and she understood the difference. He had learned to bake biscuits, eventually, which was a development that came about through a process of gradual escalation that Belle was entirely responsible for, and which produced, after several attempts that she described with scientific precision as structurally inadequate, something she was willing to call adequate, which from her on the subject of biscuits was a qualified compliment. She told him the correct ratio. He pretended he had known it all along. She looked at him across the kitchen with the expression that this deserved. He laughed, clear and whole and entirely at home in him. On a Sunday afternoon in October 1885, they rode out to the low rise above the valley as they had done many times, and Belle told him something she had been waiting for the right moment to say. She was expecting again. He turned to look at her on that rise with the October light moving gold across the plains below them, and the sky doing all the things that Kansas skies do in October, and his face was entirely clear, entirely open, carrying all of it, the joy and the memory and the love, and he reached across and took her hand as they sat their horses and held it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I think we need to write to Dr. Marsh." "I have already written to Dr. Marsh," she said. "Of course you have," he said. She smiled. He squeezed her hand. The afternoon light ran long and golden across the grass below them, and the horses stood quietly and the wind moved through everything. "Belle," he said. "Yes," she said, "thank you." She did not ask him what for because she understood what for, and it was everything, the whole of it, from the first impossible morning in a smoke-damaged kitchen to this afternoon on a hill in October. From the biscuit that hit the table like a gunshot to the laugh that had come out of him like something long imprisoned finally let free. From the closed doors and the sealed rooms and the long careful distance to this open, ordinary, extraordinary afternoon life that they were building together day by day. Season by season, argument by argument, laugh by laugh. "You are welcome," she said. "Now come on. Rosa is making enchiladas, and if we are late Danny will have eaten everything." He laughed again, free and easy and entirely himself. They turned their horses toward home. The second child, a girl they named Clara Sarah Finley, arrived the following April, strong and loud and definitive in her opinions from the first moment, which those who knew her mother found entirely unsurprising. William received his sister with the solemn interest of a nearly 2-year-old encountering something entirely new and entirely permanent, which he appeared to accept as simply how things were, which was either good character or adaptability, and possibly both. Hector held Clara Sarah on her first afternoon and said, in the quiet, direct way he had of saying true things, that this ranch had earned its happiness, and that it had it, fully and without question, which Belle thought was probably the best thing anyone had ever said about any place she had ever lived. That evening, after the hands had paid their respects and gone back to the bunkhouse, and Rosa had gone to her room, and the children were sleeping, Patrick and Belle sat together in the sitting room with the fire going, and a lamp between them and the sound of the spring evening coming through the windows. He reached over and took her hand without preamble and held it, and they sat for a while without speaking, which was one of the things she had come to treasure most about the life they had made. That silence between them had long since stopped being distance, and had become instead the comfortable shared quiet of two people who have nothing to prove to each other and nothing to hide, who have built something real and are simply living inside it. "Tell me something," he said after a while. "What would you like to know?" "Anything," he said. "I just like the sound of your voice." She thought about this for a moment. "The biscuit that started everything," she said. "I want you to know that it really was terrible. I am an excellent biscuit maker, and that was a failure of temperature and distraction. You were not right about the lard." He turned to look at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. "I was looking for a reason to speak to you." She stared at him. He was smiling with everything he had. "Patrick Finley," she said. "Belle Finley," he said. She laughed, long and full and surprised by it, and he laughed with her. And outside the Kansas spring moved across the plains with its eternal indifference to human happiness or sorrow. And inside the limestone ranch house in the valley of the Chicaskia, two people who had both been at the edge of very different kinds of dark found each other in the warm, ordinary light of a shared life, and held on, and stayed. They spent the rest of their lives doing exactly that. The ranch grew, and the years moved through it with the rhythm of seasons and work and love. They added cattle and expanded the south pasture, and eventually Patrick did take on a formal partnership with a Caldwell attorney on matters of ranching law, which was not exactly the career he had imagined at 17, but was close enough and suited him well. Belle's garden became something that people in 3 counties knew about, and she eventually wrote down what she knew about frontier gardening and food preservation in a set of detailed notebooks that she never formally published, but which circulated among women in southern Kansas for decades afterward. William grew up to be a serious, fair, honest man who worked the ranch with his father, and had his mother's specific gift for arguing about things that mattered until they resolved correctly. Clara Sarah Finley was, by all accounts, exactly the person her name suggested, bright and determined and impossible to stop once she had decided something was right. And she became a school teacher in Caldwell and later in Wichita, and was formidable at it. They had a 3rd child in 1888, another boy they named Henry, who was quiet where William was serious and gentle where Clara was forceful, and who grew up with an instinct for horses that exceeded even his father's, which was saying something considerable. Hector Reyes died peacefully in the winter of 1890 at the age of 72, in the bunkhouse he had lived in for nearly 20 years, with his daughter Maria and Patrick both present, and the sound of the plains winter around them. He was buried on the ranch at a place he had chosen himself, on the low rise with the best view of the valley, and Belle planted wild prairie grass over his grave, and it grew back every spring for years. Danny Cho left the Finley Ranch in 1887 to go back to California, where he had family and plans, and they all felt his absence with the particular mixture of sadness and gladness that comes from watching someone who has grown into themselves move toward their own life. He wrote letters for years afterward, and they wrote back, and it was a friendship that outlasted the geography it had started in, which is the best kind. Patrick Finley was 50 years old when he sat on the porch one autumn evening watching the sunset, and his wife came and sat beside him, and they looked at the valley together in the particular way that they had been looking at it for 17 years by then, with the full knowledge of everything it contained, and everything it had taken, and everything it had given back. He turned and looked at her face in the evening light, the same face he had watched across a kitchen table on a November morning, holding a failed biscuit like a prosecutorial exhibit, the face of a woman who had knocked at the sealed door of his life, and when no one answered had simply found another way in, as she found her way into everything, with complete conviction and considerable noise, and the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself but simply proceeds. He thought about Sarah, as he did sometimes, with love and with grief that had been given its proper place, and was no longer the whole of the architecture, but simply one of the materials in a structure built of many things. He thought she would have liked Belle enormously, and that they would have conspired together in ways that would have been excellent for everyone around them and probably slightly alarming. He thought about the boy he had been before the war who had wanted to argue law in Topeka, and the man he had been in the years after Sarah died who had sealed himself up and called it continuing, and the man he was now, which was the man he had been all along but more fully arrived at, more completely himself, more present in his own life than he had believed he had the right to be. He put his arm around his wife. She leaned against him. The Kansas evening did everything it did with light and color and space, and the smell of grass and far weather, and the ranch below them held everything they had built. the horses and the cattle, and the limestone house with its warm windows, the grave on the rise and the expanding garden, and the rooms where their children had grown up, and the kitchen with its cast iron skillet, and its pantry that had been reorganized more times than any pantry in southern Kansas history. He had not laughed in 2 years until she argued with him over biscuits. He had been laughing ever since. He pulled her a little closer. The sun went down over the plains, and they stayed right where they were.